Stacy Young and her husband, Vaughn Young, as he was known in Scientology, were longtime Scientologists who left in 1989 and became one of the OGs of people speaking out against Scientology, both in the courts and also in the media. And they came under withering fair game. This is the story of Stacy Young, who I knew personally, who Stacy referred to as her twin. Stick around and I'm going to tell you the story of my friend Stacy Young. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our channel, Scientology Peeling the Onion. My name is Mark Fisher, and I want to welcome you here. I have a special story I want to share with everyone today, and it's regarding Stacy Young and her husband, Vaughn Young, or as he's known in the post-Scientology world as Robert Vaughn Young. Stacy and I had a personal relationship for many years, and then we lost touch in the early 2000s. And I want to go through our time together and our history. And I hope that sometime that she could reconnect with me, because we were really close, really good friends, as you'll see in this story here today. Here's a photograph of Stacy. I'm not sure exactly when this was taken, but this was basically what she looked like. I met her in 1977 at the Advanced Organization in Los Angeles. On the right is a photograph of me and how I looked like in those early days of Scientology. And Stacy was the internship supervisor at the AOLA at Advanced Org. It was called the Silver Certificate Internship. At the time, the Advanced Organization was located attached to the Manor Hotel, where Celebrity Center is today, in the annex or the building on Bronson Street. And I came out to Los Angeles. I was, I was 19 years old at the time, and I came out there to do my internship, and I was staying at the Manor Hotel, and Stacy was my supervisor. Well, lo and behold, the other person that was on the internship at the same time was Vaughn Young, otherwise known as Robert Vaughn Young. And he was in the Guardian's office, and he was a national spokesperson for Scientology. And he also was doing the internship at the same time that I was doing the internship. And that's where I first met Stacy and also met Vaughn during that time period. Anyway, Stacy was a dedicated Scientologist. She had been an auditor at the Advanced Organization, and she was a good supervisor, training auditors on that internship. And I only was there for a few months because at the time I was 19 years old and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I ended up going back to Washington, D.C. before eventually rejoining the Sea Organization in 1978. But at the time, that was my first contact with Stacy and with Vaughn. Now, Vaughn, as I mentioned, he was a highly regarded representative of Scientology in the Guardian's office, and he was a spokesperson. He worked for Scientology's Freedom magazine. He had done a lot of investigative reporting on things like a MK Ultra program that the U.S. government was doing using LSD on soldiers and things in order to perfect mind control, that type of thing. So he was very well known in Scientology circles. And then he also, after the Guardian's office was disbanded in the early 1980s, he was taken over to Author Services Incorporated, which was the for-profit corporation that handled L. Ron Hubbard's books, movies, anything having to do with his literary works. So Vaughn was brought over there as well, handling public relations for L. Ron Hubbard. The first thing that he did that I recall was when I came out to Gilman Hot Springs in the early 1982, Battlefield Earth, the book by L. Ron Hubbard, not the movie. This is a picture of the book right here. Was about to be released in hard copy, and it was ordered that it be put on the New York Times bestseller list. And so Vaughn was put in charge of promoting the book and taking care of that sort of thing. So he had a big job, and he was responsible for a lot, working directly on things for L. Ron Hubbard. Stacy, at the time, she had also gone into the Guardian's office after I had left Los Angeles and moved back to Washington, D.C. And she worked in the public relations office in the Guardian's office until it was disbanded. And then she went over to Author Services as well as the organizing officer, which was basically in charge of human resources. If you were looking at what somebody did as in the Scientology organization, she handled human resources. That meant getting personnel, making sure they were studying, getting their enhancement done, and that type of thing back in those days. And she basically worked directly under David Miscavige, who at that time was the chairman of the board of Author Services. And he also was handling all the other things having to do with the all clear, getting the legal cases cleared out so Hubbard could come out of hiding. Hubbard had been in hiding for some time, and that's when he wrote Battlefield Earth, which is a super long book. And Vaughn Young, like I said, was intimately involved with that. He then was put in charge of, Hubbard liked him so much that this was Hubbard's other fiction work that he did at the time called Mission Earth. And this was a 10-volume science fiction series that, at the time he said had never been done before. And what it was basically one huge book, okay, that basically Vaughn was assigned the duty of editing the stories to figure out how to break it up into 10 parts and then release them as 10 separate books. And that was what Vaughn Young did. He did that. He had edited the books for Hubbard. He also wrote the introductions for each of the books so that they made sense. And he also proposed different changes and things like that to Hubbard. So he was very valuable to Miscavige and to L. Ron Hubbard because from Miscavige's point of view, he couldn't touch Vaughn Young because Vaughn Young was relied upon too much by L. Ron Hubbard. So nothing could happen to Vaughn Young. Well, Stacy had a falling out with Miscavige working as the organizing officer at Author Services. And there were things that she refused to do. This was around the time in 1982 where the International Finance Police were set up by Miscavige, and they were tearing apart the Scientology Mission Network and going after different organizations and businesses and basically stripping them of their money and sending it to Scientology. And then this also was a very heavy ethics period at the time where executives or people who Miscavige perceived to be an enemy of Hubbard or somebody who potentially could be an enemy of Hubbard would be dragged in for interrogation. And this was completely, the way it was done was completely what was considered out tech or off policy. Normally when you were getting an interrogation, what they called a sec check, or if you were getting, off any crimes that you may have committed against Scientology, you would sit one-on-one with a Scientology auditor, hold the cans on the e-meter, and then the auditor would ask you questions and you would respond. Well, Miscavige and his cohorts had designed what they called a gangbang check, which was basically several executives, including Miscavige and Marty Rathbun and other people, would actually stand behind the auditor and berate the person that was being interrogated to get them to admit their crimes, even if they weren't real crimes. They basically would berate them and demean them in front of the auditor and basically try and get them to admit that they had done things that were wrong. And this was completely out technology per L. Ron Hubbard. He did not know this was going on at the time, and it was completely crazy. And Stacy refused to do that. She refused. There was a staff member who was going to have this kind of interrogation done, and she refused the order, and she was not going to do it. I'm going to play for you now a short portion of an interview that Stacy did in 1998 for German television, where she talks about this happening.
And David Miscavige screams so loudly with such profanity that you could be down on the sidewalk in Hollywood and you could hear him screaming on the sidewalk from the 9th floor of this office building. It was a nightmare for me. It was a total nightmare. He screamed to me. He screamed to everyone.
What reason?
Because he didn't like the way we were doing things. He had been he had been uh, taught how to be an executive by L. Ron Hubbard, who also screamed at people, cursed people, used incredible profanity. But Miscavige uh, cursed more than any person I've ever heard before. And finally, one night, uh, I was refusing his orders. He was ordering me to do things to people that I thought was vicious, that I thought was not what Scientology was supposed to be all about. And I was refusing to do what he was telling me to do. Well, nobody refuses to do what David Miscavige tells them to do. But I felt that he was betraying the fundamental principles that I thought Scientology stood for. And so I found myself in a nightmare position. And he finally, one night, took me into his office, or my office actually, and became absolutely furious with me. I was very tired. I was very hungry. I was uh, in a very fragile state of mind anyway. And he screamed and cursed at me until I felt that I was about to lose my mind. So I had to get myself out of that situation, and I was sent to the rehabilitation project force for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was your mistake you made?
I refused to work for David Miscavige, and I called him a suppressive person and a psychopath.
During that conversation?
And not to his face. I told this to, actually, I told it to Jesse. I told it to another person. Um, and
You wrote it down and
and Miscavige found out about it, and I was sent to the RPF.
That's why she was assigned to the RPF at the time. Now, how did this relate to me? I had not worked for David Miscavige at that time. At that time, I had been brought up to the international base in the summer of 1982 and into the fall, and I was working under somebody else named Vicky Asnaran, and I was put in charge of approving management, communications, and evaluations and programs and all that sort of thing. Anyway, around November of 1982, I was made a jury member on a huge committee of evidence, which we've talked about in other videos before, that basically was getting rid of all of upper management, Kerry Gleason, David Mayo, Bill Franks, all these big time executives who had been in charge of Scientology for a long time. And they were going to be kicked out and declared suppressive people and excommunicated from Scientology. Well, I was a jury member on it, and I knew that the charges were false. And so I was supposed to sit there and basically, be a jury member and give them a fair trial. Well, that's not the case in Scientology. It's basically a kangaroo court. You're supposed to agree with whatever the outcome is going to be for Scientology and their justice system. And so I was having disagreements with this. It came up in my auditing, my own counseling session, that I was quote unquote disaffected with Hubbard and Scientology and Miscavige. And so I was sent to the Rehabilitation Project Force as well in November 1982. And I was sent down to Los Angeles to the Rehabilitation Project Force in Big Blue, the old Cedars-Sinai Hospital building. And that's where I met up with Stacy Young again for the first time in a long time. At that time, if you were sent to the RPF from the international base or from author services where Stacy was sent from, you were required to do what was called the running program. And we've covered this before on our video on our channel, and this is the thumbnail for the video about the running program origins. At that time, it was being quote unquote piloted by L. Ron Hubbard as a correction action for people, and it eventually became part of what they can call now superpower, and it's delivered on top of the Scientology delivery building in Clearwater, Florida, up on the roof of that huge building that they built there under a dome. At any rate, we were supposed to do the running program in order to graduate and complete the rehabilitation project force. And for those viewers who don't know what the rehabilitation project force is, I'm going to show you a picture here. It's basically hard labor. It's a re-education camp. It's basically where you're sent to become a good Scientologist and Sea Org member again. You do hard labor for 8 hours a day, and then you get 5 hours of what they call enhancement or training, which is really retraining. And then you also do processing to find out your crimes and become a better person and a better Sea Org member. And then eventually you're supposed to take somebody else through the program with you that they refer to it as your twin. And then you have to submit a big submission to get approved to graduate. And then you graduate the rehabilitation project force, and then they put you back into the Sea Organization on some Scientology position. Well, after doing the manual labor, I was put on the running program. Stacy at the time, she was up on the 7th floor of the main building at the complex, but she was under guard at the time. I had not seen her yet. Apparently, what had happened was when she was on the running program in Griffith Park, she actually stepped in a pothole while running. We did this program 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, rain or shine, until you completed the program. Anyway, she stepped in a pothole and she badly injured her back and damaged her back, where she could not stand and could not walk. So she was sent to a Scientology chiropractor and doctor and all that. And prior to me meeting with her when I was in the RPF, she had undergone extensive security checking. Miscavige thought that she was a plant, meaning a spy for the U.S. government, or trying to take down L. Ron Hubbard or Miscavige, that type of thing. And she covers that in detail in that German documentary, that German interview that I showed you a piece of. So I'll let her tell that side of the story. But I'm telling this from my point of view and my relationship with Stacy. So anyway, her back was badly injured, and they were going to send her to Clearwater, Florida, to do the rehabilitation project force there, because they wanted to keep her separate from her husband, Vaughn Young, because he was being relied upon by L. Ron Hubbard to edit the Mission Earth books. And to get that done, that was considered a top priority by Hubbard. So Miscavige had to keep Vaughn happy and in line. And so he basically said, look, she's in the RPF, she's staying in Los Angeles. He wanted to send her to Clearwater, but when she hurt her back, she could not fly. She couldn't go out there. Plus also Vaughn was protesting the fact that his wife would be sent to Florida. And that basically kept her in the Los Angeles area. So I was on the running program for 51 days. And once I completed the running program, Stacy actually came out and she finished it. She actually was made to continue to run even with a back brace on, and quote unquote completed the program. And so when we were both finished with the running program, you were then matched up with somebody who was a similar position on the Scientology bridge. I mean, your the gray chart. And then also somebody like me who had worked up at the international base, and Stacy, who had been at Author Services and had been at the international base, so that we could actually, what they say, co-audit. I would audit her and she would audit me, counsel back and forth, to finish off our security checks and our confessionals and to get cleaned up and that type of thing. So we were a perfect match as far as that went, because we were similar case level on the bridge, and we also had been in high positions and had been knew a lot of things. So there wasn't a confidentiality problem or anything like that. So Stacy and I were twinned up. At the time, I have to say that I had doubts about staying in the Sea Organization and Scientology. I still consider myself a Scientologist, and I didn't want to leave Scientology. But when I went to the RPF, I had real misgivings about the Sea Organization and doubts about it. But once I was twinned up with Stacy, all of a sudden everything just sort of came together. I had somebody else to be responsible for, and she had somebody to be responsible for, which was me. And we hit it off right away. And her nickname for me was Twin, and that continued for years after we left Scientology. I was Twin, 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 and vice versa. I called her Twin as well. We were very, very close, and we helped each other through and complete the rehabilitation project for us, and get through our programs. And we actually eventually graduated the RPF. And then I was sent back to the International Basic Gilman Hot Springs. I eventually then was promoted and made in charge of David Miscavige's office up there. And then the rest is history in regards to my time. Stacy, on the other hand, Vaughn was still at Author Services working on things for Hubbard, and she was sent back to what was the Office of Special Affairs. And Stacy was a writer. She was a very good writer. So she actually was made the editor of the Freedom magazine herself, and she wrote stories for the Freedom magazine for years. Vaughn and Stacy eventually left Scientology and the Sea Organization again, which she covers in that video interview that she did with the German television station. And I'll put a link for it if you want to see the entire thing in the description down below. So I lost touch with Vaughn and Stacy after 1988 or 89, whatever it was, that they finally left Scientology. What happened at that point was, excuse me one second. What happened at that point was I eventually left Scientology too. My story is well known and documented on our channel about my misgivings with Miscavige and the direction he was taking Scientology, and he physically attacked me and all that sort of thing. And that's been covered, in detail on other shows that I've done on this channel. So I eventually left in September 1990, and then I moved to Las Vegas and hooked up with Janice, my co-host, and her husband and her sister Terry and Fernando, and we got our lives going and started up. Moved to 1993. Actually, moved to 1991 because this happened first. Time magazine came out with the cover story, Scientology, the Cult of Greed, in 1991. And this was a huge cover story about Scientology and the corruption and what was going on. And it became the focus of huge lawsuits by Scientology against Time magazine, and also against the people who actually cooperated and told their stories in the Time magazine article. And there were some people that were being sued by Scientology. Well, Vaughn and Stacy Young, they were hired, actually stepped up, were hired by attorneys representing some of the people that were being sued by Scientology as expert witnesses. Because the problem in the late 80s and early 90s, if you were going to sue Scientology, is that the attorneys and everybody and the judges, they couldn't understand Scientology policy, Scientology bulletins, technology, the way the organization worked, the terminology, anything like that. So they needed somebody there to actually act as a translator for them, so that the attorneys could understand what it was they were looking at when they were defending people against Scientology, or if they were suing Scientology. Well, this was kind of a new thing. And Vaughn and Stacy actually were approached by an attorney and actually hired, and were being paid very well to be consultants and expert witnesses for these cases against Scientology in the early 1990s. Well, I came back. I went and worked in Texas for a short time, and then I came back to Las Vegas in late November of 1993. And that's when I reconnected with Vaughn and Stacy Young. I found out that they were out, and I found out how to get a hold of them. And remember, this is before the internet or anything like that. You actually had to use the phone book in order to find and locate people. And I got their phone number, and I called up Stacy and Vaughn, and they were in Corona del Mar in Orange County in Southern California. And I was like, Twin, and she's like, Twin, and she said, what are you doing? And I told her I was in Las Vegas, and they told me they were in California, and it was coming up at Christmas. Christmas was in about a week or two. And they said, what are you doing for Christmas? I said, nothing. And they said, well, why don't you come down? You can stay with us and spend Christmas with us. So I did. I went down to Corona del Mar in Orange County. And this is a photograph of me with Vaughn in the center and Stacy on the right. And that's their wonderful dog at the time, Maggie, who was a golden retriever, and they loved Maggie. And Maggie was around for several years. But this is us down on the, in the marina down there. And I've got another picture, a couple other pictures here. There's Vaughn, Stacy, and Maggie at the time. And then they came to visit me in Las Vegas. And this is up at Mount Charleston in Las Vegas. It's about a 20-minute drive up in the mountains, up to about 8,000 feet. And we get snow up there from time to time in the wintertime. So we went up there, and that's Vaughn and Stacy and Maggie. And then here's a picture of Vaughn, Maggie, and me. And that you notice that Vaughn is wearing an LA Dodgers jacket there, a blue LA Dodgers jacket. That actually was my jacket. He didn't have anything to wear to go up into the mountains because it was very cold. And so he liked my Dodger jacket, so I let him wear it up there. And he liked it so much, I let him keep it. And he kept that Dodger jacket. And I was really happy to give it to him at that time. So we reconnected during that time. And they told me what they were doing, that they were, doing this consulting and expert witness stuff, and they were being paid a lot of money by the attorneys to do so. I mean, like really serious money. And I had no idea. They weren't charging, they were just getting what normally an expert or somebody would be paid for a lawsuit. And so they were doing really well. They were making a lot of money. But again, of course, since they were testifying against Scientology and also, coordinating with the attorneys, they became the target of fair game. Scientology does not let that, they don't let that alone. They came after them big time, and they started fair gaming Vaughn and Stacy with private investigators and all sorts of dirty tricks, which I'll go into in more detail in a few minutes. They loved living down in Corona del Mar, and that basically were just doing that full time. Now, I had not spoken out at all prior to that, at all about Scientology, even though I had similar disaffections and things that I felt about Scientology. And I was working in Las Vegas, and at the time, Janice's husband Paul, he had a mortgage company. They had a mortgage company here in Las Vegas, and he didn't want to have anybody getting involved with any anti-Scientology stuff because he didn't want to, create any or have any negative effect on the mortgage company. The funny thing is, though, we had already had private investigators in our company that we had hired as employees that were spying on us for several years, and I'll get into that in a minute, right? So it didn't really matter. Well, I didn't really particularly care, so I went down to see Vaughn and Stacy because I was going to reconnect with my friends, and I would support them behind the scenes. I told them, I said, I can't be out front, but if you need to ask me any questions or anything like that, I'd be happy to do so. So that's what I began to do. After a while, the fair gaming, I want to mention one thing too. The fair gaming became very heated against Vaughn and Stacy. And so Stacy moved up to Seattle, Washington, actually to West Seattle in an area called Alakai. And they rented this little house right on Puget Sound. Where that's Stacy and Vaughn, and that's Maggie, the dog again. And I went up to visit them up in Seattle several times, and I would hang out with them up there. So they moved up there, and they still continued their consulting work, right? But at the same time, they also were being, like I said, fair gamed, and also Scientology was trying to negotiate to get them to step aside and not do the work that they were doing any longer. Here's a picture of me during one of the visits up there to West Seattle. That's Stacy, and that's a young me. As you can see there, I don't look like that anymore, but that's me and Stacy. And then here on the other way around, there's Stacy and Vaughn. And then here we are standing out there on a park in West Seattle, and that's Vaughn and Stacy. And Vaughn's got one of the cats that they had. That's going to figure prominently here in a minute. There's Vaughn holding the cat right there. During that visit that I just showed you photographs of, the day before, Mike Rinder and a guy named Mike Sutter from RTC, Mike Rinder, who was the commanding officer of the Office of Special Affairs, had just left the day before because they had been there for a few days negotiating with Vaughn and Stacy to get them to stop doing their expert witness and consulting work against Scientology. They were there trying to work out a settlement and pay them off. Well, they had come to, after several days, they'd come to an agreement between Mike and Vaughn and Stacy. And then that agreement was set up to David Miscavige for his approval. And he reneged on the agreement. He said, if you want that kind of money, which they worked up basically how much they would need in order to continue working for several years without, what they would get paid doing the consulting. And they came up with a number. And Mike had agreed to it, Mike Rinder, sent it up to Miscavige, and he basically reneged on the whole thing. He said, if they want that kind of money, they're going to have to earn it, in the real world. And so Vaughn and Stacy said, okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go and do that. So they broke off negotiations. So Sutter and Rinder had left the day before I arrived. And you can tell by the photographs, again, I'll show them again, that they had been under stress. Okay. You can see that right there on their faces. Stacy had lost a lot of weight, and Vaughn, and they were under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure in order to try and settle. But they wanted to continue speaking out, and they also wanted to continue doing the consulting on the lawsuits and stuff like that. So it took quite a toll on them. Well, that didn't stop Scientology, but I'll get back to that story in just 1 minute. During that time period, I came up to visit Stacy several times and Vaughn. I was reconnecting with my father, my own father. I had left Scientology, like I said, in 1990. I disconnected from my father and my brother in 1979, 1980, because my dad left Scientology and was declared a suppressive person, along with my brother, who was only 16 years old. So I had disconnected from them while I was in the Sea Org up until I left in 1990. But I was afraid of my father because I was so indoctrinated in Scientology that it took me 2 or 3 years for me to peel my own onions to feel that it would be safe to go and talk to my dad again. So I had first connected with my brother, went to see him in Ohio where he lives, and reconnected with him. Well, my dad at the time, he actually lived in Washington State, not far from Seattle. And I reconnected with him over the phone and arranged to go up and see him, as well as see Stacy and Vaughn up in Seattle. Well, I was afraid to go see my dad. I'm sorry to say, I'm ashamed to say at the time, because I didn't know what to expect after all that time. So I asked Stacy, as my friend, to come with me and my brother to go see my dad and his wife at the time. And she graciously did and came with me. And we had a great time visiting my father and reconnecting with my father at the time. So this is a photograph that Stacy took of us. That's my brother on the left, me in the center, and my dad on the right, and of course Maggie, the golden retriever, there in the center. And behind us is Mount Rainier. This is a photograph from 1995, 1994, sometime in that time period. So it's not great photo quality, but Mount Rainier is behind us. My dad lived in the middle of Washington State. And so I was able to reconnect, and Stacy was such a friend that she came with me and helped me to reconnect with my father. And I maintained that connection with my dad on a good basis until he passed away a couple of years later after that. So I just wanted to mention that's the type of friend that Stacy Young was to me at that time. Back to their story. They, like I mentioned before, were under tremendous fair game because they decided not to take that settlement. Scientology, they upped the ante on them even more so. This is a photograph, like I mentioned before, Vaughn holding a cat. Vaughn and Stacy, they loved cats, and they started a rescue operation out of the goodness of their hearts, out of their home there in West Seattle, where they would actually adopt, take in foster cats, that type of thing, and keep them in their little home. This is that home I showed you before. It was a small place. It was a 1-bedroom house, really small, really just a cottage. And when I came to stay with them, I'll never forget this. there probably were 16 cats in that house, in that one bedroom house. And you basically felt like you were a human being living in a cat cage or in a cat house, because there were cats everywhere, climbing over things and all that. And Vaughn and Stacy loved it. They loved the animal rescue that they were doing, and they were adopting out the cats. They were finding good homes for them, that type of thing. Well, once they turned down the offer from Scientology to settle, Scientology set up some of their private investigators, and this is the guy that they sent up there. On the right there, that's a guy named Dave LeBeau, and that's me on the left. Dave LeBeau was the private investigator that was sent into Las Vegas to become our friend and to work with us at our mortgage company to spy on us. And he spied on us for several years. And he was a Scientology private investigator who we later found out was a private investigator. We didn't know it at the time. He then, for years, was Scientology's go-to private investigator against Mike Rinder, Leah Remini, Marty Rathbun, all sorts of people, and he became the main guy. But he basically, we had no idea. He was basically our friend, our employee, that type of thing. Well, we had found out that he was a private investigator before the fair gaming began against Vaughn and Stacy up there in Seattle. And Vaughn told me about this guy who was up there, and he described him to me. And the guy was organizing protests out in front of their cottage up there in Seattle with signs and stuff like that, and handing out flyers to all the neighbors about their cat sanctuary, their cat rescue place, and that their cats had AIDS and were spreading AIDS amongst in the community, that type of thing. And they were trying to get the neighbors to put pressure, and also on the landlord to make them move out. And they were doing all sorts of things. They actually reported them to different officials up there in Washington State. They tried to get Stacy committed to a mental institution up there. They really went hard and heavy. And Dave LeBeau was the guy. This was the guy who was organizing that stuff all up. After Vaughn described for me what the guy looked like, I sent him a picture, probably this one here. I had several pictures. And I said, this is the guy who was spying on us. And he goes, that's the same guy. That's the guy who's up there. So that's how they were able to confirm that he was up there working for Scientology. Because as always, when they are up there doing fair gaming and protesting, they don't advertise that they're Scientologists. They just start, citizens commissions for cat rights or whatever the heck it is. They come up with some stupid front name, and then they go after these people. So they went after Vaughn and Stacy quite hard and quite heavy because of that. And they eventually, they had this cat sanctuary. Meanwhile, Vaughn was, he was on the internet. The internet was in its infancy in the 1990s, and he was on various message boards. One was Alt Religion Scientology, and he reposted on there as Robert Vaughn Young, etc. And Scientology, of course, was trying to shut down these internet groups. You know what I mean? Well, they were fighting it, saying, people fighting against Scientology were saying, wait a minute, it's just freedom of speech. We have freedom of speech here in the United States. What are you talking about here? So that's where a gentleman by the name of Robert Minton, got involved, because he followed those message boards, and he had no connection with Scientology whatsoever. But he was a big-time free speech advocate, and he didn't like what was happening on the internet against Vaughn and Stacy. And he connected with them to find out, what was going on and all the fair gaming and stuff that was happening. So he found out that they were, having trouble with their animal sanctuary and all that. So he actually bought them a house out on Vaughn Island, which is in the Puget Sound area. Excuse me. In the Puget Sound area, for them to where they could have lots of room and lots of land, and they could get it properly zoned and that type of thing for their animal sanctuary. And Bob Minton was a multi-millionaire, and he befriended them and basically helped them move to the Vaughn Island. The Scientology continued the harassment out there. They even kidnapped one or two of their dogs, had private investigators kidnap the dogs and pull their teeth out and they would find the dogs, wounded on the side of the road. And Scientology was doing everything that they could to try and stop Vaughn and Stacy from speaking out. They couldn't stop them, though. They decided to start speaking out in the media, and also they did lots of interviews. They did an interview with MTV, Kurt Loder. They did an interview with 60 Minutes. They did an interview, like I said, with ABC 2020 and all sorts of different things. And they started speaking out at that time. I'm going to share with you now just a short clip of an interview that they did in 1998, if I'm not mistaken, with ABC News. I think it was ABC 2020. And I'm going to share this with you here. One second here, bear with me. And just a portion of the interview. They started speaking out nationally. And this is way before anybody else was really doing this sort of thing because of Scientology's withering attacks and fair gaming.
At the time, Vaughn and Stacy Young were high-level public relations officials in the church.
At 4 a.m, one night, Vaughn and I were asleep, and there was a knock on the door, and 2 security guards were there, and they took me away into the prison camp.
Stacy Young says she was assigned to the RPF for disobeying an order to interrogate a fellow staff member. For part of the time, Young says she was in a room on the 7th floor of the Los Angeles church. Her husband admits he stood by and did nothing to try to get her out.
You're being challenged that, what are you? Are you disloyal? Do you love your wife more than freedom for the planet? You're going to let people suffer? All this crap is dumped on you. And what are you supposed to say?
I didn't see Vaughn for several months. I didn't hear from him. I didn't have any correspondence with him whatsoever. He did nothing to try and rescue me. I felt that my husband should have rescued me.
I didn't take her out. I look back at that. I should have just picked her up. And I should have just said, if anybody touches me, you're dead.
Even after Stacy's release from the RPF, the Youngs remained loyal. But in 1988, Vaughn Young says the church turned on him too, and he began his own 13-month stint in the RPF.
You go through interrogations, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, breaking you down.
A year after Vaughn's release from the RPF, the Youngs say they had had enough. They threw some clothes in the back of their car and fled.
Herbert's policy was, as long as you're with us, we'll leave you alone. But if you speak out against us, we're going to dog you and ruin you and destroy you. And that's exactly what they keep trying to do.
That's from ABC 2020 in 1998. That actually, where they're walking around in the grass with the dog, that's the house on Vashon Island that Bob Minton bought for them to house their animals and do their sort of thing. But that they started speaking out, like I said, on that. Now, Vaughn, he was actually on the internet as Robert Vaughn Young, and he was brilliant. He was a great writer, and he basically, told the stories of what was really going on in Scientology. He did a lot of investigation into the death of L. Ron Hubbard. He's the one, I think, who found out that L. Ron Hubbard in the autopsy report had been injected with Vistaril, which is an antipsychotic drug at the time, and he exposed that on the internet. So Vaughn never gave up and was continuing to investigate and disclose things. And he was highly regarded. And this is in the 1990s. People may forget, the internet was just in its infancy, right? But Vaughn was so wise about the whole thing that he said at the time that the internet was going to be Scientology's Waterloo. And for those who don't know what Waterloo is, that's the battle that Napoleon, when he was trying to conquer Europe, where he met his match and he lost in Waterloo. And Vaughn Young said that Scientology met its match with the internet, because once the OT levels, OT3 and all those different confidential levels were released on the internet, he said that the the dike would be broken. There would not be enough fingers that you could put in the dike to stop the bad information from getting out to the public. Because once people found out what was on those confidential levels, who had no idea what Scientology was about, they would stay away in droves. And you know what? He was exactly right, because that's exactly what happened. So that was what was going on with that. The next thing that occurred after that, and I'm not going to go into tremendous detail, is the death of Lisa McPherson. And this was a Scientologist who had a psychotic break. Took off all her clothes in downtown Clearwater, was basically, quote unquote, rescued by Scientologists and taken to the Fort Harrison Hotel. And then she was held there under their, quote unquote, care for several weeks, and put through a rundown, a process that they did in Scientology to cure psychosis. And she basically died. They dehydrated her to the point where she died. And this became a major deal, because the family and the officials in Pinellas County, Florida, were going after Scientology for criminal charges, and not just Scientology. Also, David Miscavige was being looked at and investigated, because it turns out that David Miscavige was the one who was actually overseeing the handling of this woman's case at the time. So he didn't want anything to happen. I mean, number one for him was stay out of jail, and that's a whole nother story, a whole nother chapter, which has been covered many times, about what was done to keep Miscavige protected. It took several years. Mike Rinder and Marty Rathbun were involved in that. I'm not going to go into those details here. But what happened was Bob Minton and Stacy Young, they went down to Clearwater, Florida, and they set up what they called the Lisa McPherson Trust. Bob Minton funded it. They bought a building, and they started doing protests like you see today out in front of the organizations down there in Clearwater, Florida, the Flag Land Base and all that sort of thing. And they were right under Scientology's nose, which then attracted a lot more attention. Jesse Prince joined them there. Stacy and Bob Minton, they actually got Tori Chrisman out. Tori Magoo, which you all know on the internet. She's told her story about what Stacy and Bob Minton did to get her out of Scientology. And she's, of course, been one of the most prolific people who speak out against Scientology for years and years and years. Well, Stacy had a big part in that, as did Jesse Prince and Bob Minton. Now, Vaughn and Stacy, unfortunately at that time, they ended up getting divorced. The pressure became too much, and they split, and Vaughn ended up moving to Cincinnati, Ohio, and eventually, unfortunately, he contracted prostate cancer, and then he became a big advocate for research into prostate cancer and that type of thing, and he wrote blogs and different things about that up until the time that he died. But he did testify in depositions for the Lisa McPherson lawsuits, and he did testify in many court cases against Scientology. And of course, I'm going to do a more in-depth video about Vaughn Young at another time, but this is more my relationship with my friend Stacy Young. When she moved down to Clearwater, Florida, and she connected up with Bob Minton, they recruited Jesse Prince, and Jesse, of course, I had known when I was in Scientology as well. And they had all said, we're going down to Florida, and we're going to set up and do these protests and that type of thing. Well, I was intrigued, because I thought, wow, I would love to go down there and see what's going on. I mean, after all, I was getting much more bold in terms of my speaking out a little bit about Scientology. And I thought, oh, this would be a great way to stick my finger in Miscavige's eye down there in Clearwater if I showed up down there. Well, he found out through a Scientology spy, a private investigator who was posing as my friend. I had no idea at the time that I was planning on coming down to Clearwater, Florida to see Stacy and Jesse and Bob Minton and the Lisa McPherson Trust. Miscavige was down there fighting the legal cases and trying to stay out of jail. And when he heard that I was coming down there, he issued orders to Marty Rathbun and Mike Rinder, keep Fisher out of Florida. So they came up, they had their quote unquote, person posing as my friend, who was actually a private investigator. they had him. He was going to come with me down to Clearwater. That's how come they found out about it. And he told them that we were going to come down and visit. Well, they told him, no, you've got to come up with a different plan because we don't want Fisher down in Florida. They didn't want me to connect up with them down there, right? Because I'd worked intimately with Miscavige for years. And one of the things that they were attacking Miscavige on was that he controlled everything in Scientology. They didn't want me anywhere near down there. So they came up with a plan where they had this guy arrange from an all-expense paid trip down to Puerto Vallarta in Mexico to meet with an investor. At the time, this guy who was posing as my friend was setting up a cell phone company business, and he wanted me to work with him. And we were going to go down to Mexico because we had this investor that could meet with us down there that would put some money into the company. But we had to be that weekend. It had to be that weekend. It couldn't be when we were going to go down to Florida. So unfortunately, I decided, at the time, okay, well, I am looking out for my survival at this time, and I had no idea that this was a Scientology setup. I agreed, and I said, okay, I'll cancel the trip to Florida. So I contacted Jesse and Stacy and said, I'm sorry, I can't come down, and I'm going to Mexico, and I'll stay in touch. Well, this is the photograph of the guy. This is down in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. That's me in the black T-shirt and sunglasses. And then the guy on the right is a guy named Ferris Khan, and he was the guy who had been posing as my friend, and he actually posed as my friend for over 9 years. As a matter of fact, he became one of my best friends. We talked on a daily basis. But this is us down in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, to meet with this investor down there for several days, at which time he then filmed me doing, at a gentleman's club and tried to get blackmail material on me to send to Miscavige because they wanted to basically keep me away from Florida for good. So that's what happened with that. Scientology, I didn't learn about this trip until, probably 9 years later, in 2009, when Marty Rathbun and Mike Rinder had left Scientology and started speaking out to the St. Petersburg Times newspaper for the Truth Rundown series. And I got a hold of Marty. I had heard if he wanted to get in contact with him, there was a way that you could email him. So I emailed him and asked him about why did Miscavige have, private investigators, investigating us in Las Vegas. We weren't doing anything. We were just trying to live our lives. And he wrote back and said, well, yeah, but we still had somebody who was still following you up into the 1990s, to the late 1990s. And I said, so I called him and I talked to him, and he told me that they did this whole thing where they sent me down to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, to keep me out of Florida. And I went, he didn't know who it was that set up the trip because he didn't arrange it. It was arranged by somebody else. I said, oh, that's my friend Ferris. I just talked to him on the phone yesterday. That's how I found out that this guy had been a spy and had been so for years. And then I eventually spoke out to the St. Petersburg Times. This is in 2009, 9 years later. And I did my interviews, and that's when I really started speaking out, and I've been speaking out ever since. So that's the connection there in terms of Scientology and their dirty tricks and what they were trying to do to protect Miscavige. Now, Dave LeBeau, the earlier private investigator I showed you, he was investigating Bob Minton at the time. Bob Minton, like I said, was an international financier and multimillionaire, and I don't need to go into all the details, but they basically had LeBeau go down to Africa where Bob Minton was doing business and dig up some quote-unquote dirt, planting seeds, that type of thing, and then threatening his family, and then eventually threatening him with IRS problems with money and that type of thing. And they went after Bob and Stacy had gotten together, and this is Bob Minton and Stacy down in Clearwater. And they were heavily involved in many lawsuits and different things that were happening against Scientology. But then all of a sudden, they folded their tent. They shut down the Lisa McPherson Trust. They settled with Miscavige and Scientology. Mike Rinder was involved with the whole thing on his side of it, and that's a whole nother story. But at that point in time, I lost complete contact with Stacy. Her and Bob Minton basically, signed over, I guess, all the whatever it is that they had to sign over, and they disappeared off the scene, and I had lost track. This was, I guess, in 2003, 2004, and I had no way of getting a hold of her. So I lost contact with Stacy, and I have not had any contact with Stacy to this very day. I've not spoken with her or contacted her. I don't even know how to get a hold of her. All right. But I still have this connection with her, and I still feel this friendship towards her. I thank her every day for the things that she did in my life. And eventually, unfortunately, I heard that Bob and Stacy were living in Ireland after this whole settlement. And then Bob Minton died. He had a heart attack and died several years ago. And then Stacy, from what I've heard, is that she went back to her maiden name, which is Stacy Brooks. And last I heard, she's in Atlanta back with her family. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the last that I heard from Stacy. But anyway, if you'll notice, I'm wearing this shirt, connection shirt with the heart and two arrows pointed towards it, because I'd love to reconnect with my friend Stacy Young. So if you're watching this, Stacy, I would appreciate it getting back in contact with you, because we're friends and we will always be friends. And if you want to reconnect with me, you can email me at markfisher57@gmail.com. That's markfisher57@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. I would love to reconnect with you and exchange war stories in terms of what's happened over the last 20 something years. And I still consider you a friend. So if you're out there, Stacy, I know you probably had to sign non-disclosure agreements and, say that you would never reconnect with anybody who's speaking out against Scientology. That may be true. But, if you want to contact me under the radar, I would greatly welcome it. And I want you to know that I still care about you, and I still care about Vaughn, and I miss you. And I want to thank you for helping me to reconnect with my father and my family. And that's the story. That's what I wanted to tell about my personal relationship with Stacy. Now, if you want to see that German television interview, I'm going to put a link down below where you can see the entire thing, right? And that's the deal on that. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button. I really appreciate it. And then if you have any questions or comments about what I've talked about here, go ahead and go down the comments section and you can ask there. If you'd like to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee. There's a link down below where you can click on it and buy us coffees. We really appreciate the support. And then if you'd like to buy a Connection t-shirt with this logo on it, or a coffee mug, we have a coffee mug. And then also I got a stainless steel, like a for cold drinks with a straw and all that. That's also on our merchandise site. So there's tabs down below. You can click on them and just shop through our merchandise. This Connection shirt and coffee mug are great gifts that you can send to your family members or friends who you've lost connection with or who are still in Scientology, and it won't be flagged as something, anti-Scientology, because it's just connection and a heart with two arrows pointing towards it. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for their support of our channel and all that. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was difficult to put together. I've been wanting to do it for some time, but I hope you all enjoyed it. And until next time, everybody, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.